Good evening and welcome to everyone. My name is Barbara Slater. It's my pleasure to introduce this evening's presentation on behalf of the First Parish in Lincoln and the Conservation Law Foundation. A special welcome to our speaker, Staci Rubin, Vice President, Environmental Justice at the Conservation Law Foundation, who will be speaking on the topic of environmental justice is racial justice, centering equity in our region's climate movement. And to Andy Founder, also welcome. Andy is a member of the First Parish in Lincoln. He's a senior fellow at the Conservation Law Foundation, former president of the Appalachian Mountain Club. He's happy to learn. And he will be introducing Staci and also moderating the discussion. So let me acknowledge our co-sponsors and thank them. The Lincoln Public Library, the Lincoln Land Conservation Trust, Lincoln Wide, which stands for Welcome, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, Mothers Out Front Lincoln, 350 Mass Metro West Node, St. Anne's Climate Justice Ministry, and Metro West Climate Solutions. That's 7 groups co-sponsoring this event. You can see there's a lot of interest in this topic. We appreciate the involvement of all these organizations. And of course, thanks to the Conservation Law Foundation and the First Parish in Lincoln. And among the people there, the Racial Justice Advocates, FPL Green and Outreach Committee have been active in hosting this event. I'd like also to introduce Sarah Klakowski, who will manage the Zoom arrangements. Sarah, raise your hand. And Tom Walker, who is chair of FPL Green, and he will be managing the questions in the chat. And Kate Bibo with the CLF is behind the scenes, assisting on all fronts. So we ask that you hold your questions until discussion at the end, and you can either put them in the chat, which will be monitored, as I said, by Tom, or you can raise your hand, or you can raise your mechanical hand. And that will just zip you right up to the upper left-hand corner of the screen. So Sarah, would you explain how the closed captioning works for everybody?
Yes, so we have a live transcript enabled on this evening's program. And if you would like to turn on the closed captioning, all you have to do is move your mouse down to the bottom menu bar and you'll see live transcript as an option button. So just click that to enable the live transcript and you will be able to follow along using closed captions should you so desire.
Thanks. So let me say just a few words about the racial justice journey and the issues module that we have been on. First Parish has embarked on a racial justice journey over this past year. During the summer and fall months, we examined American history and culture as they've been affected by enslavement and other forms of racism in this country, and particularly in New England. We've participated in lectures and panel discussions. We've had documentaries, and we've also enjoyed field trips. So we're now engaged in our second module, which focuses on contemporary issues of racism and the ways in which racism and racial disparities permeate our lives and our experiences today. We have explored residential patterns shaped by redlining. We've looked at the intended and unintended consequences of a variety of federal government policies. We've looked at health disparities shaped by race and residence. We've considered wealth creation in BIPOC communities and other topics, including tonight's on environmental justice. It seems as if we are just scratching the surface and there is so much more to explore and so much more to learn. And yet we also want to move on and consider actions and what we can do about and with some of these issues and some of these problems we've encountered. So it's not that we're giving up on issues, but we're also thinking about how we can incorporate real consideration about what we can do as individuals and as a community. So our third module will be focusing on actions. And we'll be working to see what we can do to reduce the injustices that we have observed. So I'm looking forward to this opportunity that Staci Rubin is providing to help us learn about environmental justice and the way environmental issues intersect with race in the greater Boston area. So again, welcome, Staci. It's so nice to have you back. We met you a couple of years ago. And next, Andy, will you take over and introduce Staci? Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Let me take this this occasion to thank you very much for the leadership that you've shown on this journey to date. It really has been terrific. When I was thinking about tonight's event, I realized that making a positive impact on environmental justice is really very important to me. Let me give you a few examples which explain why I feel this way. As some of you know, I get to lead Friday afternoon walks in Lincoln and into adjacent areas. On these walks, it's quiet, peaceful. We breathe clean air. Last year, we were actually able to explore 35 different trails in Lincoln alone. During the last couple of weeks while walking, with tonight's event on my mind, I kept thinking, if I lived in Chelsea, in Roxbury, in East Boston, I doubted I would have anything close to these opportunities. Is that fair? What can I do about this inequity? At another time in the last few weeks, again, when thinking about tonight's event, I realized how different my perspective would be on the climate crisis if I lived in Chinatown, in Roslindale, or East Boston. No question, I'm extremely concerned about the world I'm leaving for my children and grandchildren. But if I lived instead in an environmental justice community, I would see, I'd feel, I'd experience the climate crisis now. It has arrived. Heat islands, rising sea levels, polluted air. And transportation also came to my mind. The commuter rail was seldom late when I took it daily from Lincoln Center. And when I went by subway to Alewife, the backup on Route 2, sure, that was a pain, added a additional 10 minutes, but a red line car was always waiting. Is this the same experience you'd have in an environmental justice community? I doubt it. I've been concerned, maybe I should say burdened, with these unfair inequities, both recently and over many years. But I've been lucky. The opportunity to be part of an organization that is able to make a difference. I've been a part of an organization that is able to make a difference. I was introduced to the Conservation Law Foundation actually nearly 40 years ago, first as a member, then as a partner leading a partner organization, and more recently as a board member, as well as Barbara mentioned, as a sort of a day-to-day in-house volunteer. I got to know what CLF was doing, often in detail. I learned this is an organization that just doesn't just talk about the issues. I'd have to use my favorite word. It has real impact. And I got to know many of the advocates, including Staci Rubin. Many of you attended, as Barbara mentioned, Climate Sunday about 3 years ago at the First Parish when Staci was one of the speakers. That was I'd have to call it an inspiring event because friends in Lincoln still talk about it. And so it is so great to have Staci back with us. When I looked at Staci's bio on the CLF website, it says that she partners with residents of historically marginalized communities. In reality, she not only partners with them, she previously worked with them when she worked at ACE, the Alternatives for Community and Environment. And when she worked for the Department of Public Utilities, she learned firsthand the challenges of dealing with state agencies. On the specifics, Staci has a law degree from Northeastern, a master's degree in public health from Tufts, and a master's in environmental law from the Vermont Law School. But that's enough background. It's now my honor to introduce Staci Rubin. Staci, take it away.
Andy, thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And it is a joy to have worked beside you at Conservation Law Foundation for the last couple of years. I am so thankful to be back here. Thanks to Barbara for being one of the masterminds of this event. I'm so inspired that First Parish in Lincoln is on a racial justice journey. It's really been wonderful to see you all come together. And I loved being part of Climate Sunday. I cannot believe that was 3 years ago. So it's a joy to be back, and it's a wonderful turnout tonight. So my plan for tonight is to go through some slides. I want to make sure that I share Conservation Law Foundation's vision of what racial justice means, what environmental justice is, and then talk about some real opportunities where I think you all can be incredibly helpful to the environmental justice movement in Massachusetts. I'll also tell you some stories about the work that I've been able to do in partnership with residents of Chelsea and Roxbury and Springfield and beyond. So let's get to it. So Conservation Law Foundation, just a little bit about us. We are a regional environmental organization working in the 6 New England states. And one of the things that I find most interesting about our work is that we have a set of values. One of those values is justice. So we believe that justice should be infused across the organization in the majority of the work that we do. We have as a core value the notion of collaboration, which I think is phenomenal and a great example of how we come in and say, we're not doing this alone. We're doing this in collaboration with multiple organizations, with residents, with workers. It's not just us, we're here to collaborate. And then I also just want to highlight the value of optimism. This is a value that we came up with throughout a lengthy strategic planning process. As we thought about the climate crisis and how dire the situation is, we all talked about the fact that we still want to come together and work to address the climate crisis, and we want to do it with optimism. So I love that there's so many negative things that we can talk about going on in our world, from wars in all corners of the world, not just in Europe, but beyond. You know, we can face all of that with a sense of optimism about how we can come together and make a difference. Oops, sorry about that. So what is environmental justice? I like to think of it as making sure that people are able to have a say and influence what happens in their community. But we need to recognize that not everybody has an equal ability to influence those decisions. When we look at historically who has been most burdened by the unequal and inequitable distribution of environmental burdens and benefits, we know that Black, Indigenous, communities of color, limited English proficient speakers, and low-income residents are the ones who have been disproportionately burdened. And so I've pulled a quote from a wonderful environmental justice advocate and researcher, Dr. Dorceta Taylor, who is with the Yale School of the Environment. And she says that environmental justice is concerned with understanding the disproportionate and unequal environmental burdens that certain communities face. In the United States and around the world, low income, Black, Indigenous, and Asian people tend to be living in spaces where environmental hazards, extreme natural and human-made disasters, and environmental degradation occur more rampantly. Again, a core value is understanding the history and the data about where polluting facilities are located and where the benefits of open space and parks and the ability to go on these close hikes near our house, like Andy was talking about earlier, that is not equally distributed. So I want to talk a little bit about Conservation Law Foundation's environmental justice program. I've got a wonderful image down here on the left of a bus, and I'm wondering how many of you have been on a public bus where you just feel like a sardine, where it's just a very not dignified experience, where you're frustrated. And I'm just curious, I'm kind of scrolling through the windows. I just want to see it. Raise your hand if you've ever been feeling like one of these people on one of these buses. I am seeing some hands. Not many, but some. Thank you. So it's a terrible experience, right? And unfortunately, there are many people in communities of color, low-income neighborhoods. Yeah, I love all of these hands. Thank you so much. This is great. There are so many people in these limited English proficient neighborhoods that experience this regularly. It's not just a one-time thing, but it's an all the time situation. And that's the kind of thing that Conservation Law Foundation is trying to address. And we're doing this through a racial justice lens. We recognize that racial injustice happens and has been a systemic problem, and we need to come together through community-based partnership if we're going to work toward a systemic change. And we have this term just transition, which is aimed at thinking about how do we transition to a clean energy economy, a fossil fuel-free future that really prioritizes these communities that have been historically marginalized, that prioritizes giving jobs, really high-paying, high-quality jobs that are good for their health to workers who've been historically left out of the workforce, particularly the construction and clean energy workforce. So I'm talking about women, people of color, people without a formal education. You know, I have a lot of letters after my name, but most people do not. And we need to make sure that people who may have a criminal record have access to the training and ability to get some of these jobs that we are creating through the transition. So there's a couple of pieces of work that we do in our environmental justice program. I'm going to talk today about a lot of transportation work. It's a personal favorite of mine, and it's something that's so concrete for people to understand. So we're working on transportation access and affordability. We're working on eliminating lead poisoning. Lead is an issue that is so persistent still to this day. You know, there's been laws banning the use of lead paint for so many years, dating back to the 1970s. Yet the lead poisoning prevention, the blood lead levels of children of color in particular, and those living in public housing is so high, and it's still an issue that we need to address. We work on zero waste initiatives. So we're trying to figure out how to make sure that we're sending fewer materials to be buried and burned. And we're trying to figure out how to ensure producers of those of plastics, for example, can be responsible for creating change in their community, can be reducing how much is getting burned and buried. We're also centering people in solutions to the climate crisis. So that is very exciting, and I'm going to talk a lot more about that today. And we do this work through a community lawyering and community organizing lens, which means, again, that partnership with people on the ground from the grassroots up, not from the top down. So I want to give you a couple of statistics here about why we focus on racial justice. This is not a new issue. The environmental justice movement has been using a racial justice lens for decades. And there is data that continues to come out on a, I would say, weekly basis, confirming the need to focus on race. So there was a great study that came out of the Midwest showing that we see 200,000 premature United States deaths annually. And that's Blacks, Latinos, and Asian Americans are facing a much higher exposure to soot compared to white people, leading to these premature deaths. We have limited English proficient households, Black and Brown communities that are most burdened. We actually have a study that's coming out very soon from the Conservation Law Foundation. We looked at transportation and climate burdens all across New England. And we have found, especially, it's the limited English proficient households that are most cumulatively burdened by high heat temperatures, by not having enough trees or pervious ground that we can make sure cools off our neighborhoods at night. And these are the communities that are lacking the ability to evacuate in the event of a major storm or some other issue. And then lastly, I just wanted to highlight the fact, for those of you familiar with the Roxbury section of Boston, Nubian Square is a predominantly Black community, at least currently. There's a little bit of history that has changed the demographics over the years. But the average lifespan for a resident in that Black community is 60 years or less in that neighborhood. But if you travel about 1.25 miles away from that, you get to the Back Bay, which is a much wealthier and a whiter neighborhood, where the average lifespan is over 90 years. So just that, 1.25 mile stretch makes a major difference from a public health, and it's a life and death situation. So these are current statistics. This is not historical. These are all current studies. And I'll just give you some more statistics if I haven't sort of, blown your mind a little bit yet. I also just want to highlight a few more transportation focused statistics. There's some great research that came out of the Metropolitan Area Planning Council and Livable Streets Alliance that Black bus riders are spending 64 hours more per year on MBTA buses compared to white riders. So that's happening because most people of color are having to transfer from one bus to another, or from a bus to a train, or a bus to a train to a bus to get where they need to go. And all of that is leading to this additional time on the buses. I can also tell you that a number of dropped trips, or buses that don't actually stop to pick up passengers, are much more frequent in environmental justice communities, which are those communities of color and low-income neighborhoods. Now, I'd also like to just talk about air pollution. So the Union of Concerned Scientists did some great research and found that residents of color are exposed to air pollution from vehicle emissions that are 26 to 36% higher than exposure of white residents. And this is mostly due to the fact that you've got housing that is very close in proximity to congested highways, for example, or busy roadways, and those are most likely to be occupied by people of color because they're affordable. And then lastly, I think about transportation justice and thinking about, who has access to public transit versus, who is paying and how much people are paying versus how much people are paying to drive. Now, what's really interesting is that Massachusetts has a long history of keeping the gas tax very low, whereas we've raised the gas tax 3 times since 1991, and the sort of overall tax rate has actually decreased for the gas tax, while the MBTA fares have increased 50 to 80% over that time. It's sort of an average increase in fares every 3 to 4 years. So a major inequity just in terms of the amount of costs that people are paying to get around. So the state of Massachusetts very much penalizes people who have no option but to take public transportation in terms of increasing fares. So let's talk a little bit about environmental justice and some federal law. Environmental justice is not just the right thing to do to think about how do we address these inequities, it's the law. So this dates back actually to the 1960s with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that prohibits discrimination on the basis of race among some other categories. We also have what's a famous executive order in the environmental justice community signed by former President Clinton, Executive Order 12898. So that was back in 1994 and specifically required federal agencies to promote non-discrimination in their programs, as well as address the issues of disproportionate burdens for people of color and low-income neighborhoods. I will say that implementation of that federal executive order hasn't gone very well. And now fast forward to when we have our new President Biden and Harris administration. So we saw 2 executive orders within the first few weeks of them taking the oath. And those executive orders require an affirmative commitment to advancing equity in federal programs as well as racial justice. And something that I'm pretty excited about called the Federal Justice 40 Initiative. Justice 40 is all about allocating a minimum of 40% of investments in climate and other environmental spending in what they're calling disadvantaged communities. So those are, communities of color, low-income neighborhoods. There's a lot of questions about how the Justice 40 initiative is going to be implemented. But we are at the forefront working with our community-based partners to try to influence, how do you measure whether it is 40% of the benefits are going to these populations? How do you define these disadvantaged populations? So a lot to think about there. So let's move on now to Massachusetts. So environmental justice is the law in Massachusetts. And I will say that I have spent more than a decade trying to get an environmental justice law passed in Massachusetts. And I know plenty of people who have worked for 20 years and more to get what we succeeded in achieving last March. So environmental justice dates back actually in Massachusetts to 2002, where we got our first policy that says environmental programs are not sort of equitably impacting people across the Commonwealth. And there was a recognition that there was some really polluting facilities who were not keeping up with their permits. They were not complying with environmental laws, and those were most likely to be located in communities of color. So there was a policy saying the state has to do something about that. Spoiler alert, they really didn't implement that environmental justice policy all that well. So I was very active in trying to work with community-based groups when I was working at Alternatives for Community and Environment. And we succeeded in getting former Governor Patrick to sign an executive order. And that required the establishment of an Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And that council was supposed to be making recommendations to the governor on how every single secretariat, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Public Health, the environmental agencies, how all of them were supposed to address environmental justice. Here's another spoiler alert. There is still no Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and we are now more than 8 years beyond the requirement to make this happen. So I was part of a broad coalition, and there's a great picture of us from the World Asthma Day a couple of years ago when we were advocating for the passage of an environmental justice law, a statute in Massachusetts, and that got integrated into the big roadmap climate law that was passed last March. So it was incredibly exciting that we were able to make this happen. That law requires integrating environmental justice considerations into environmental review. It defines who are these impacted communities, who is impacted first and worst by the climate crisis, who needs to benefit from state programs. And it also directs the consideration of cumulative impacts in state decisions. So let's talk about some opportunities for you all to be involved. So another component of that roadmap law that I just mentioned is that the state of Massachusetts needs to have a clean energy and climate plan talking about what is going to happen between now and 2025 to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and what needs to happen between now and 2030, again, to reduce our emissions. And that plan does not address the environmental justice issues that we see in our Commonwealth. So there's actually going to be a public meeting, one next week and one the week after. So these are open to the public, and I want to encourage all of you to attend and to talk about what you care, what you want to see in our state's commitments to getting to a clean energy and a better climate future. So we will send out these materials afterwards so that you can find out exactly how to register, but please, this is one way to really take action. So if you attend, you'll show up, there will be a state presentation, and I would encourage you to really advocate for electric public transit. One of the things that was totally missing from the draft of this plan is it said for the transportation sector, which is the biggest contributor of climate damaging emissions amongst all the sectors, it said people are going to buy an electric vehicle. We're going to get to 750,000 electric vehicles on the road. That's great if you have the money to buy an electric vehicle, but there are so many residents of Chelsea and Holyoke and New Bedford and Fall River who are not able to buy a new car. So they're not going to be able to benefit from a tailpipe-free pollution car. They're not going to be able to buy that electric vehicle. So the solution that we need for environmental justice communities are electric transit. Why are we seeing the MBTA purchase diesel buses? Why are we spending state dollars to buy diesel when there are electric buses available today? We should make sure that our children are traveling in electric school buses that don't pollute to get our children between our homes and our schools. So I encourage you to advocate for that. We also are trying to make sure that there are state rebates and incentives available for people who want to buy used electric vehicles, and for those to be available when somebody's buying the vehicle or leasing the vehicle, for example, and not waiting to submit their rebate and waiting 7 or 8 months to get that $2,500 rebate. We should also be advocating for maintaining mature trees. I can't tell you how many community-based organizations are calling Conservation Law Foundation and saying the city or the state or some private developer is looking to cut down 50 trees in my neighborhood. What do we do about it? So this is something that we're seeing every day, and we need our state to make a commitment to maintain healthy, mature trees. We need to stop paving surfaces. We need to figure out how to reduce what's called impervious surface. And I also want to mention, a key climate solution is electric heating, getting off of our gas or our oil heat. And heat pumps is a well-known technology that is proven, but it's expensive and it requires a fairly large upfront cost. So we need state incentives that can make this option affordable for everyone, with a greater amount of incentives available for low-income families who just don't have the upfront dollars to make this work. Here's another opportunity for you to get involved. I mentioned that the roadmap law talks about cumulative impacts and requires any certain developers who are getting their environmental permits to look beyond the site boundary. how do we figure out, what other polluting facilities are contributing to poor air quality or to water pollution? The cumulative impacts assessment is meant to sort of quantify all of that, to understand how residents are concerned about a proposed polluting facility. And that cumulative impact assessment is something that the state Department of Environmental Protection is trying to figure out how to do it. So they've got upcoming public meetings the end of April, and I very much encourage you to attend. It's a great opportunity to hear what the state's thinking about. One of the big pieces I would encourage you to advocate for is that if the result of a cumulative impact assessment is that there is a burden, particularly on a community of color or a low-income neighborhood, then the agency should deny a permit or reject a proposed application for a facility. Too often, our environmental agencies keep just saying yes to whatever utilities want, to whatever big developers want, and we need to challenge that. So this is where I want to get into some fun stories. So I had the absolute pleasure and privilege to work with residents of Chelsea and Somerville, two communities of color and a lot of low-income residents who live there. So I'm going to talk about some geography that hopefully you all know. So there is a law in Massachusetts that says that on I-93 that runs north to south through Boston, that there should be a high occupancy vehicle lane between Medford and Somerville on I-93 going southbound. And that lane and high occupancy vehicle lane status has been a requirement since the 1990s. So it says that you have to have at least 2 persons in a vehicle in order to use the lane. And the reason that that law was established back in the 1990s is because we were trying to encourage more people to travel in fewer vehicles. So this was meant to incentivize people to carpool. It was meant to get people who were taking public transit on buses to get through what's typically a very congested roadway. So what happened was the State Department of Transportation, which operates the highway, decided back in May of 2019 that they were going to eliminate that lane and make it available to all drivers. And they notified the public about this using Twitter. So they sent out a tweet in English only and said, it was a Friday night, they said on Monday of next week, anybody can use that lane. We're eliminating that lane as a high occupancy vehicle lane. So you might say, why does this matter? Well, here's why it matters. So the reason that they were looking to eliminate that high occupancy vehicle lane is because there was construction. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor here, but there is construction happening on Route 1. The work was to make improvements to the Tobin Bridge that connects Chelsea to Boston. And the thinking was that that construction work was going to reduce the number of lanes on Route 1 for 2 years. And so they wanted to make sure that people traveling from the North Shore, maybe Swampscott or Salem or beyond to get into Boston, would have a faster alternate route. So the thinking was a lot of people would no longer take Route 1 to get into the city. They would travel to I-93 and come in that way. So we initially were concerned because the Department of Transportation was violating the law by just eliminating this lane. And we were also concerned because residents of Chelsea and Somerville said to us, we're constantly getting the short end of the stick. Here's a construction project that is directly causing air pollution in the city of Chelsea as they do their work on the Tobin Bridge. There's all sorts of dust that was falling on cars. I had a resident send me a picture of somebody's car. It was a July day, and they were able to write hello on the hood of the car. And it looked like that car was covered in 6 inches of snow. It was not snow, it was dust. So that is the kinds of impacts that the residents of Chelsea were having to breathe in because of that construction project. So not only did they have a lot, slower traffic, fewer lanes, dust, noise from all of this project, but they also weren't getting any sort of benefit from alternate transportation to get where they needed to go. Meanwhile, over in Somerville along I-93, residents were complaining that they were already seeing more cars, more traffic on the highway. And because of that increased traffic, people were coming into Somerville and using local streets to try to avoid the highway. And I had a lot of Somerville residents who live very close to I-93 talk about how they saw so much more soot on their windows. I've had many residents say, I can't open my windows in the summer when it's really hot because of the amount of soot from the highway, from car emissions that are on my window. So we partnered with the Welcome Project, which is an immigrant rights group in Somerville. We partnered with the Somerville Transportation Equity Partnership, which is a transportation advocacy group in Somerville. And then we partnered with Green Roots and the Chelsea Transportation Task Force, which is a multilingual group led by residents of color focused on environmental justice. So we complained to the Department of Transportation and we threatened to file a lawsuit. So these are just some of the residents that we were working with on this issue in Chelsea. And I've got this picture on the lower right, which is one of many very heated conversations between residents and people from the Department of Transportation. So we threatened to file a lawsuit and we alleged that this was a violation of the federal law, the Federal Clean Air Act. It was a violation of state law, which requires a permanent HOV lane on I-93. We said this was a violation of environmental justice policy and the executive order. And as a result, MassDOT agreed to settle the case with us. So they reinstated that high occupancy vehicle lane back in 2020, which was much sooner than they were planning to restore the lane. And I think the biggest highlight is that we got 2 bus lane pilot projects. So a commitment of at least a year to have a bus only lane on 2 major highways. This is the first time we have bus lanes on highways in Massachusetts. So currently there is on both the northbound and southbound side of I-93 between Woburn and Medford, which is the beginning of the high occupancy vehicle lane on I-93, buses can go on the shoulder, the right-hand shoulder, and it's only for buses. So that's actually saved a significant amount of time. We've heard these 2 lanes just opened a couple of months ago. And then there's been a bus lane on the Tobin Bridge over Route 1 for about 8 months now, and it has saved riders of the MBTA Route 111 bus an average of 15 minutes. That one bus lane over the Tobin Bridge has made the commutes, cut them in half by being able to do this. So we were able to meet with decision makers that included community partners and got commitments from the Department of Transportation to do better. And this is just a picture of the bus lane. So again, this is prioritizing people of color who are dependent, low-income riders, dependent on public transit to make sure they can get where they need to go efficiently without having to sit in traffic. So we're trying to see more of these bus lanes. These are definitely part of the climate solution for transportation. So just another couple of examples. So I don't know if any of you have been to the new Green Line extension that now, as of just a couple of weeks ago, no, not even last week, we celebrated on March 21st, the opening of the Green Line extension to Union Square in Somerville. So this was a commitment that Conservation Law Foundation secured dating back to 1990. So when the proposal to do the Big Dig project happened and CLF filed a lawsuit and said, you're violating a number of laws and we need better mitigation that's going to incentivize public transit. There was a commitment back in 1990 to build the Green Line extension to Somerville and Medford. And 32 years later, it was great to be at the ribbon cutting that happened. So I encourage you to ride the Green Line to Somerville, to Union Square. And the Medford branch is opening at some point this summer. We don't have an exact date, but I promise you we will be partying. So I've got a picture here of the ribbon cutting. It's a little hard to see, but the picture in the middle, there's a wonderful green ribbon, and the actual train itself did the cutting of the ribbon. So that was pretty exciting. And I'm standing here with the president of Conservation Law Foundation, Brad Campbell, and some of our community partners from Somerville, celebrating the opening of the Green Line extension. And then another example of our environmental justice work in the transportation realm is around the Fairmount commuter rail line. So the Fairmount line is the only commuter rail line that runs entirely within the city of Boston. It runs from South Station to Reedville in Hyde Park, the Hyde Park neighborhood. So for many years, that train bypassed the neighborhoods of Mattapan and Dorchester, and those were the communities of color. It's a community of color that really had to breathe in the diesel emissions from those commuter rail for many years and not be able to ride. Again, Conservation Law Foundation filed some lawsuits, and we got 4 new stations opening, including Blue Hill Avenue, which is in Mattapan. I was at the ribbon cutting there 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago. And these are some of the residents that we partnered with to get those new stations. We also got a recent victory again, because that line, that Fairmount line, now has many more frequent trips during the day. So you don't have to wait 3 hours between trains coming. There's going to be an announcement coming very soon about the Fairmount line. So I'm very excited about that. And we've been partnering with residents in Dorchester and Mattapan and Roxbury to increase frequency and service, and hopefully move to electric trains, specifically on the Fairmount line in the near future. So this is what environmental justice looks like in Greater Boston and some of the people we work with. Just getting back to how do we think about climate, centering equity in our region's climate movement, we need solutions that focus on people. We need to have a people-centered approach. You know, you can talk about numbers of reducing greenhouse gas emissions all you want, but if we're not actually making a difference in people's quality of lives and their health, then we're not succeeding. So we need to make sure that our policies are holistic and that communities are at the table helping to influence those conversations. We need to achieve compliance with multiple laws. As I've mentioned, we have an environmental justice law. You know, it's not just a concept, it's the law. So we need to make sure that we're not just reducing emissions at some places. We need to make sure that people who live next to I-93 and in the shadow of the Tobin Bridge are really able to see improved air quality, and not just making sure that the electric school buses are in Concord only. Again, it's got to be thinking about EJ laws at the same time as we're thinking about our climate. And we really need to understand the cost benefits of the health impacts that are going to be associated when we reduce emissions, when we improve air quality. So a couple more opportunities for you to get involved. I know Barbara said that your next conversation is going to be around actions, but I wanted to highlight a few things that you can do here. I am highlighting a couple of bills that are Conservation Law Foundation's priorities along with our partners. And again, we'll send these around. So I would really appreciate if you would be willing to learn more about these bills. Again, we'll send information, and for you to call your representative and your senators and tell them that you support these bills. So we've got an air quality bill that would say we have state climate targets. We now need to make sure that we're improving air quality in air pollution hotspots next to highways. We also, this air quality bill talks about doing mold remediation and having very clear ways that people who have mold in their homes can get that remediated so that it can improve the health and quality of life. There's an energy siting reform bill. right now, the majority of power plants and energy infrastructure are in communities of color, low-income neighborhoods, and limited English proficient communities. The people who decide where that energy infrastructure goes are not thinking about environmental justice. And so we need to reform how those decisions are made. This bill will do that. We've got a bill that says that our state vehicles have to be electrified by a specific date. We want to see deadlines for our public transit system to become fully electric. And lastly, we have what is called the Access to Justice Bill, which says if you believe that you have been subjected to discrimination, that you can go into state court and you can advocate for your rights. And if the judge finds in your favor, there are your legal costs are covered. You are paid and you don't have to prove that somebody intentionally discriminated against you. So these are our 5 laws or bills that we think are necessary to become law to really achieve environmental justice in Massachusetts. So just to summarize, ways that you can take action, call your legislators. And in particular, I've got the names of legislators who are heads of the committees where these bills are located. Call them and tell them that you support these bills. Talk about what you want to see in our state's clean energy and climate plan. Come to these meetings in April. And also, if you want to learn more about and talk about cumulative impact assessment, please show up to the Department of Environmental Protection meetings at the end of this month. So with that, I am going to just turn it over to Andy so that we can get us into some questions and discussions. And I thank you so much for listening to that presentation.
I could probably take up all of the remaining time with the questions that are on my mind. But let me just start this off. Well, first, let me start off by encouraging you to either raise your mechanical hand or put questions in the chat if you have them. But giving you a couple minutes to do that. Let me, maybe this is a confession on my part, but all too often, I think when I get these notices on national issues from NRDC and EDF and similar organizations, or as you've done today, the encouragement to get engaged in state level, I think, well, my federal rep, Catherine Clark, she already is, totally committed. The senators couldn't be better. Our state senator for Lincoln has been Senator Barrett, and he led the effort on the roadmap legislation. So I'm just sort of wasting my time making these phone calls. What's the response to that?
Thanks, Andy. The response to that is, I think that legislators need to hear more. We are often hearing from legislators that they're not hearing enough from their constituents. So they might hear from somebody outside of their constituency that they, care about an issue. But if they're not hearing enough from people in their district, they're much less likely to want to take action. And frankly, I think that a senator or a legislator, a representative who can say, I've received 15 calls in the last week on an issue, that's just going to bump up the priority compared to some other bill. So there's a way to get legislator attention, which they're pulled in too many directions. So I just think more calls, more engagement is really needed to get bills over the finish line. Even sometimes when we have really supportive legislators, we need to do that.
Tom, let's start with the question that's in the chat.
Sure, we've got a question in the chat that is asking, is there any way to stop the MBTA from spending a huge amount of money on turnstiles and instead get them to invest that in electrification or a greater frequency of service, I guess. So is that something that CLF is working on, or something that we as citizens can push the legislature or the T to actually make happen?
Yes, thanks, Tom, and thanks, Jennifer, for the question. So actually, right now, the MBTA has a capital investment plan out for public comment. And we know that they are not proposing to spend the money in the right way. So there's not enough focus on electrification, and now is the time to advocate for that. So it's a great question. I can do in a follow-up email the way that you can get involved to submit your comments on the capital investment plan. We will be submitting comments on behalf of our organization and organizing transit advocates and environmental justice advocates to say we need to electrify and not spend money on turnstiles. One other issue is the T is upgrading their fare collection system. So when you tap your Charlie card or your Charlie ticket, that system, it has to be upgraded. And they are spending more than $1 billion to upgrade that system just so that they can be able to take our money on credit cards. And they're paying to put these new fare collection systems on buses. We think it would actually be more cost effective to just get an all electric fleet and to make buses no cost than to spend all of the billions they're going to spend installing these systems and having people come onto the buses and check that you've paid your fare. So we are very involved in spending conversations at the T.
Tom, it looks like people are hesitant to raise their hands, and they're putting questions in the chat. So keep them going.
Okay, a second question we have there relates to the Kendall Square Cogen plant, which the questioner identifies as the largest emitter in Cambridge. And the question is, apparently this plant releases a lot of PM2.5 particles, and is there a way to clamp down on fuel oil burning in this plant? Is that something CLF is focused on? And is that something citizens can have an impact on, reducing the emissions from?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, certainly there is a requirement for these kinds of emitters to be reducing their emissions over time, but it really doesn't help people who live right next to this facility. So if you're living in Cambridge, you're still breathing in this really, really bad air. We are certainly advocating for the retirement of these old fossil fuel facilities and replacing them with renewables. And renewables that are responsibly sited. We very much believe in distributed generation. We are supporting offshore wind that is respectful of the right whales and that we're preserving fishing rights, as well as being really actively working with the tribal communities. So there's a whole effort that we are working on to move toward renewables and away from these polluting facilities. And we're trying to do that in conversations with communities that are impacted and being mindful of the non-human species in our world. I would just say, this is another issue. Call your legislators if you are concerned about this, because the legislators can play a role in helping to get these older facilities shut down if needed. But it's great to hear that there's some concern about this particular facility.
Before going to the next question, one opportunity that I meant to mention earlier is the CLF practice of having blogs on these various issues. And if some of you are like me and find that the 10-page technical papers just aren't providing the kind of motivation to really get to the point, you'll find these blogs that take 2-3 minutes to read are just a great way to keep up to date on these issues. And just go to clf.org and you can go through some of the recent ones. Joan, why don't we go to you for your question?
Yes, thank you. I used to be director of the Riverways program at Fish and Game. It's now called the Division of Ecological Restoration. And we did a little bit, I retired about 12 years ago, but we did a little bit of racial justice work in Chelsea and places like that. And I've been very concerned about the rivers because the urban rivers are so polluted. They're polluted by air pollution, they're polluted by stormwater runoff, they're polluted by just about everything. Are there river bills that you all are following? Are there still racial justice issues on these rivers? Because I think of so many that were just heartbreaking, you know, the Housatonic that had, and just, you know, all across the state, the Saugus, the Taunton, the Mystic, the Chelsea. So are there bills that you're working on now? And you may be working with the Rivers Alliance, but.
Yeah, it's a great question, and congratulations on your retirement and your work with the division. So we are very aware of those issues, and we've actually worked in partnership with residents of Chelsea and the Mystic River watershed, and we are also working with Charles River Watershed Association on cleaning up those really toxic soils in our rivers. So that is still very much an issue. We've been focused on more on the sort of lawsuit side, enforcement side, less on specific bills that would make a difference. So I will say, for Conservation Law Foundation's perspective, there's not some bills that we are prioritizing this session on this issue. But I am sure that there are river groups who are doing that, and we're focused on making sure there's funding to do the cleanups.
Could you mention an enforcement thing that you have been concerned about or working on? I know that was my second question, so I'll go away.
Don't go away. No, one of the issues happened probably 9 years ago in the Chelsea Creek. There was an oil spill in that area, and we advocated that there was a penalty that the polluter had to pay. So we advocated that be a higher number, and that money go to the locally impacted community. Often what happens is that money goes to the North American Wildlife Conservation Fund, which it requires like 20 acres or more to benefit, which a lot of our urban river areas don't have that kind of space for a wetland restoration. So we helped advocate, and by we, this was prior to my time at Conservation Law Foundation, but sort of the we that I am now still working with in terms of the community was advocating that money stay local. And so there is now money for those kinds of, river restoration, wetland restoration, and parks projects in the proximity to the spill. So that's the kind of work that we're trying to do.
I can't resist, Staci, encouraging you to, I know it's not your area, but it's so related to Joan's question to mention just quickly the Exxon and Shell cases. If we're concerned
Sure.
about rivers, you sure couldn't be more on target than what those are all about.
Absolutely, Andy. So Andy's right. We have some major cases against Shell and ExxonMobil. We think those companies have oil terminals. There's a couple different locations, but Everett is one of the locations that we are focused on. And the companies who manage those oil storage tanks are not prepared for severe weather. So we filed suit, which is advancing in the federal courts, saying that the companies have an obligation under several federal laws to be preparing for a storm surge, for a flooding, and what happens when those tanks break, because we're not ready for this. And so we've actually been able to advance beyond almost every case. This is one of the major climate cases moving forward in the country, and we've got some national attention on the issue. So it's very exciting.
And it's really not too far off to say these are really environmental justice cases.
They are, and in fact, the Everett case, we do have some of our Chelsea residents are affiants, or they've signed documentation explaining this is how we're impacted by a particular issue. If there were to be a spill in my neighborhood from this facility, this is how I would be impacted. So we're absolutely trying to protect all of the communities who live near these storage tanks.
Tom, back to the questions, please.
Okay, we have an interesting one from Jim Fleming, who raises the issue of what do we do when development of renewables poses issues in EJ communities? And I think he's looking to, the development of offshore wind around the New Bedford area and the potential impacts there with, the assembly of wind turbines and the impacts from bringing the power onshore from the turbines that are offshore. Are there laws or legislation coming down the pike that will address those kinds of conflicts or potential conflicts?
That is a fantastic question. And frankly, I've been spending my last 3 years at Conservation Law Foundation exactly trying to figure out what is the solution to that issue. So we fundamentally believe that we can do and need offshore wind. And we also need to be planning for how that impacts, again, the right whale, the fishing community, the non-human species, and how the community is impacted. So we've actually had some conversations with indigenous tribes who are concerned about this and want to make sure benefits are coming to the tribe. And we're thinking about what happens when the transmission lines are coming on shore. How do we work with the community groups to figure out the siting of that so that it really minimizes impacts and maximizes benefits? So it can be done. It's not about, we can do jobs, we can do justice, we can do renewables, but it's got to be done very thoughtfully. And I will say our siting reform bill that I mentioned in my presentation, and I will put in the chat unless Kate does it first, that is the bill that is trying to address this particular issue. So we're really excited about that bill and would love support from all of you if you're willing.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think the next question's, a related one, which is, in some of these communities, we may see rents go up as there's greater demand for, housing and workers in those areas. And that could also be an impact from this kind of economic development that's happening there. And, those kinds of impacts may also be important and need to be addressed in these EJ communities. So I think that's maybe that's more of a comment than a question, but it seems like an issue that deserves attention as well.
It's a fabulous comment and question from Andy Platt. I will say an hour before the Green Line extension ribbon cutting in Union Square, or it was at Leechmere, there was a protest, a gathering about gentrification and displacement, that people were telling their stories about how their rent has increased so much that they can no longer afford to stay in Somerville. And that's a real issue. So we need to think about how do we do more development that doesn't displace people. I think there are all sorts of housing strategies and policies that we're thinking about at CLF. We also have the Healthy Neighborhoods Equity Fund, which is making investments in building affordable housing near transit and making sure that those buildings are sustainable, energy efficient, high indoor air quality, without gas stoves that negatively contribute to poor indoor air quality. And it's a really thoughtful way of investing in affordable housing near transit that's accomplishing a number of different sustainability, justice, and affordability goals. So I would say I'm really impressed with that work that we are doing, and there's not enough of it. We need to be doing more because I think we haven't solved all those problems yet. Oh, Andy, I think you're muted.
That was the first time I did it. Why don't you take another minute though on that project? I happen to think it's a terrific one, and you might be interested in knowing. I know there are at least a couple individuals in Lincoln who have invested in it.
That's phenomenal. So what's so great about the Healthy Neighborhoods Equity Fund is that it combines affordable housing with public health, with investment strategies. And it's all about how do we have a holistic, sustainable model for housing and climate and environment. So we have a limited amount of investments, and it's wonderful that some of you have contributed to that. And the thinking is, how do we score projects that we think are going to maximize the sustainability, the public health features? So we've got what we call the health score. It's this wonderful tool that figures out, how do we maximize the number of affordable units, again, close to public transit. And we have, also in connection with that work, we have modeled in 9 different communities in Greater Boston, if rents are increasing, where are people moving to? So we've got this wonderful map that shows, if people are unable to stay in East Boston, for example, where are they moving to? So we've got this really interesting track of the displacement that's happening throughout several Massachusetts communities. So I think there's some really interesting data gathering. We're still coming up with solutions, but that Healthy Neighborhoods Equity Fund has, I don't know the numbers of how many units we've been able to invest, but just recently had made a more than $5 million investment that was, the difference between making the project get over the finish line and get to the construction point.
It's another example of how innovative staff members are at CLF. When I first got involved as a board member, I thought the people heading that subject were just nuts to think that they could make a success out of that project. And I just could not have been more wrong, once again. Not to get too focused on my mistakes, let me call on Ken Hurd.
Hi, Staci. Thank you for coming out to little old Lincoln to share your knowledge. But I'm very interested in your thoughts. Lincoln has done a lot of conservation, as you know, but it also has a target on its back because our housing is so, it's not very dense at all. And with the new Housing Choice Act, there's pressure to do more. So it's really a competing interest. On the one hand, we'd like to fly our flag that we've done so much for conservation, but on the other hand, we're guilty. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how these competing interests work in your, or how they play out in your work.
Sure. It's a great question, and I thank you for raising it, Ken. So I think we need more housing. Housing production is one part of the conversation. We need more densely populated multi-family housing, particularly in areas that are close to public transit, commuter rail, buses, et cetera. And there's been some opposition in communities, wealthier communities, not wanting to see these larger multi-family homes coming in. And frankly, in my own community, there's been some opposition to a densely populated multi-family project. And people are worried about, too many children coming into the schools, and that mindset really limits what we need to be doing. And I think part of the equation is also thinking about how do we have affordable housing options? How are we keeping rents below? I mean, at this point, it's almost more, if you have the money to buy a house, it's actually more affordable to buy a house than pay rent. In places like Everett or Chelsea, it's absurd how high these rents are going. So I think it's a combination of, we definitely need more production. We need to make sure that there's more densely populated, larger multifamily buildings that are able to be built close to transit. And we need to make sure that we have policies to keep housing affordable. So I think it's sort of a 3-pronged approach that has to be done thoughtfully, and it's not easy to do. And I understand there's a lot of controversy and discussion about it.
Can I ask a follow-up? Have you been involved in any project in any town necessarily that finds a way to balance these competing interests successfully?
This is a little bit, I haven't done a lot of the housing work directly. It's more some of my colleagues that do the work. So there's not a particular example that's coming to mind, but I would be more than happy to follow up with you offline and get you some examples.
Great, thank you very much.
Barbara.
Yeah, this is a slightly different direction, but something I'm very much interested in, and I'm curious to know how CLF establishes relationships with the community groups that it works with. Take Greenworks, for example, or some of the others that you mentioned. Where does the initiative lie? How do you organize yourselves? Are you on issue-based or geography-based, or just how do you bring it all about? How do you make it happen? Maybe you could give a couple examples.
I love that question. Thanks so much, Barbara. Green Roots is an example of a set of residents that I've been working with for, I don't know, 17 years. And I think Conservation Law Foundation did have a relationship with Green Roots, but I think when I got here, I helped to deepen that work. We generally just try to get to know community-based organizations. We like to go in and listen to what people are saying. And it's about a years-long process of building trust. I think we've had a number of victories that demonstrates that we don't go into a community and tell them what to do, that we want to go in and listen and have the community generate the solutions, and we work together to implement. So I think that process has really been beneficial to our relationship building. We are doing some amazing work in Manchester, New Hampshire. So we have a Manchester resident that we brought on staff as a community organizer who just had a lot of friends and family. And he said, we don't have environmental justice groups or advocates. So he just convened a group of people over coffee and said, let's talk. And they had such a good conversation about transportation issues and about food access issues that he said, all right, let's come back together. And, it's now been about 1.5 years, and that's our Environmental Justice Advisory Council in Manchester. So we're building that foundation of a set of EJ advocates in Manchester. And we've got some conversations happening with Black-led groups in Burlington, Vermont, and we're at the newer end. And they say, tell us about your successes working with Black-led groups elsewhere, prove to us that we can trust you, and so we're building the relationship, and we're not coming in and saying, here's what we're going to do. We don't have an agenda other than to get to know them. So I think that's the way to do it. And similarly with tribal organizations, we're meeting with tribes to say, what do you care about? This is what we care about. What do you care about? Is there a way to collaborate? So I think it's that trust building and not, trusting the community expertise that's in there.
And it sounds as if you're reaching out and really trying to figure out different groups you can work with and that could be effective with you. In other words, some of the initiative is coming from you as opposed to the group coming to you and saying, can you help us?
I think that's right. And there are some groups that I worked with like 12 years ago who are coming to CLF now and saying, hey, we need your help. So some of it is just, the long-term relationships, and some of it is just others saying, we heard that you're working on a substation issue in East Boston. We want your help in my neighborhood. And so that comes too. So it's sort of happening in multiple ways.
And I was wondering about the spin-off effect too. If some groups see what you're doing and then they either amalgamate or also want to involve themselves in such a relationship with you. So
exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks. So it's great. And we really work toward mutually beneficial relationships. That's the goal.
Thank you.
We're just about out of time, and in fact, I think we're more than out of time. But there is one last question there that Tom, you want to read that one?
Yeah. It's whoops.
Do you see it? It disappeared.
No, I see it. It's asking Staci whether you can talk about your EJ work with the MIPA review process.
Absolutely. And Pallavi and I know each other well. So Pallavi's familiar with this work. The Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act is the state act that looks holistically at large projects before they get into the permitting phase. So part of the roadmap law requirements are that the environmental review process now consider environmental justice issues. So I've been very active in working with the MIPA office in an approach that's going to work better for EJ populations. So one example is it is now the requirement as of January 1st of this year, that any developer that has to go through environmental review has to do outreach in the community at least 45 days before they file any formal paperwork. So they have to affirmatively reach out to community groups. There's a list that the state has given them, and they have to explain the project. They have to meet with residents if the residents request a meeting. If there are concerns raised, they have to be able to respond to those concerns. So this early engagement is something that we really think is going to improve projects, potentially reduce lawsuits and litigation down the line, and ideally work out to have a much better outcome all around. It also requires a deep understanding of what's happening beyond that property boundary to see what are other polluting facilities that are contributing to what's happening. So we are very active, and something else that we're advocating for in that Mass Environmental Policy Act review is that any development that's happening in the state has to notify the certain tribes and indigenous organization officials to say precisely where they're looking to dig or precisely where they're looking to develop, because it allows the tribes to say there are historic artifacts or burial grounds or some other sacred aspect to that tribe. And that's something that theoretically should have been done and required for so many years. But unfortunately, we're still advocating it for it to this day. So that's now part of this NEPA review process that we're working on. And again, that's in partnership with groups like the North American Indian Center of Boston, among other tribal connections. So I'm really proud of that work, and it's hard work. There's a lot to do to implement these laws.
So many important issues. Let me take the facilitator's privilege and ask you to clarify just one thing before turning it back over to Barbara. You talked about people signing in to some of the hearings, and you also talked about contacting your local rep. Now, signing into those hearings, I'd like to think all of us are so dedicated that we'll do all of the above. Signing into a hearing, takes 2 or 3 hours. Sometimes you can understand what's going on. Sometimes I can't. Calling your rep takes 5 minutes. No, 3 minutes. How do you? What's your final advice on the trade-off there?
I think you do whatever you can do, but if you're going to call your legislator, most likely you're going to talk to one of the staff in the office, and all you have to do is say, I am calling to support bill number H3336. I really care about where energy infrastructure is cited. I live in this community. This is my neighborhood. Please have the senator vote in favor of H3336. It's really basic. You don't have to have a lot of deep knowledge about the bill. You don't have to, have any more information. But if you just call up and say you care, we have heard so many times that legislators say just getting like 3 calls about the same bill in a short period of time changes the focus of their day and changes how they make decisions on bills. So that is the sort of low-hanging fruit that I would encourage all of you to do as a result of tonight.
Great. I just want to conclude my part by saying, Staci, you're terrific. Thank you very much for doing this evening. And Barbara, let me turn it over to you for concluding.
All right. Well, yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Staci. And this has been, it's been inspiring. It's also been informative, but I've appreciated your sense of optimism and that there are things we can do. We all feel somewhat paralyzed by what's happening with climate change and global warming, not to mention some other things going on. And here you've given us very concrete things we can do, that we can take some action and we can call or we can attend a meeting. And moreover, there is legislation that's out there. We're not having to write it. It's there and we can react and help transform it. And I think this is just really important and really, really valuable. So I'm hoping that lots of people on this call will do that, because we're all concerned. we've got the green team, we're a green town, and we are concerned about all these issues. So I hope we can live up to that. And let me, in addition to thanking you and thanking Andy, you're a great moderator. It's just terrific. It's fun to watch you. Let me also thank our co-sponsors who were an amazing group, and also the Conservation Foundation more broadly, and the First Parish more broadly for hosting us. I would like to invite you to a documentary that we are showing next Thursday, April 7th. It's called The Power to Heal. It's a PBS documentary. It's very powerful. It's about the exclusion of Black Americans from basic health care, hospital services, training. It provides a missing link in terms of the civil rights movement. We've all heard a lot about the educational efforts for civil rights, not so much about integrating hospitals, not so much about bringing healthcare, hospital services to Black and Brown communities. So it's really a very valuable documentary, I think, and it raises a lot of questions that are important today, right now, as we've dealt with COVID, as we've thought about whether healthcare is a right or a privilege, and so on. So do try to come. And there will be, as I think we've said, a recording and slides available from Staci's talk. And they will be available on the First Parish website and also in the Racial Justice newsletter. You can sign up with Joan Kimball for the newsletter. And Joan, I don't know if your email is in the chat, but if it isn't, maybe you could get it in.
I'll put it in right now.
At all.
I'll put it in right now.
Okay, and thank you all for coming and for participating, Staci and Kate and Andy and Tom and Sarah. I think I've got everybody. Appreciate your being here and appreciate your role in making this event happen. Thanks so much. And good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you so much.